So to start off, I'm going to tell you my story because it's an interesting one. So my field, my background is really in engagement and engagement and policy development. So I've done numerous roles working for Indigenous government, federal and provincial governments. And it was really around engagement policies, duty to consult and accommodate, um, and some research sides to that. And from there, I ended up in this field of doing engagement in energy. And it wasn't an area that I was particularly familiar with, even, let alone knowledgeable in, but it seemed really interesting. And what was interesting about it to me was that it was situated in the circumpolar north, so northern Canada and northern Scandinavia. And this was the area that I worked in all the time. So I thought, okay, you know what? I've got relationships with a lot of these communities. Let's go talk about energy. And at the time, my research was really around quality of life research. And I realized after having conversations with community members and leaders and elders and youth that energy is so closely tied to the questions I had around quality of life. And this became this much bigger conversation around how do we look at cleaner, more affordable, more reliable energy for our North, or our communities in general. So that started a whole new research question, which has turned into part of my master's and essentially my PhD. Although I'm going to be talking about engagement in nuclear quite broadly, my specific research is in SMR, small modular reactor implementation. And I think a lot of the things that I'm talking about around engagement can be applied to most engagement situations, be it Indigenous engagement or otherwise. So there's some kind of general best practices I'll touch on, but I really am focusing on small modular reactor development. So this really leads us with the question of, what is an SMR? For those who don't know, it is an emerging technology in the energy sector right now. So in Canada, our federal government has adopted both an SMR action plan setting forward to implement or look at implementing small modular reactors as a source of energy in Canada. The provinces of Alberta, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Saskatchewan have all signed an MOU to explore this. And in Saskatchewan, our utility is currently looking at whether this is an option. So small modular reactors are essentially smaller nuclear reactors. These aren't the typical large reactors that we're used to seeing or that we see in Ontario at Darlington or Bruce. These are much smaller in scope, in size, in landscape that they take up. They're also smaller in generation. So they can include anywhere from 3 to 300 megawatts sources of energy. And we have kind of 3 different categories that our Canadian Nuclear Society or Commission has classified them in. So we have very small reactors, which are on the lower end, and then going up to the 300 one. At the higher end. And it's really the higher end ones that a lot of our provinces are looking at for that utility scale development. A very small modular reactor on the lower end has a lot of application for some of the more remote communities or mines, etc. So when it comes to implementation of this type of technology or potential implementation, there's a few things that we know. So we know that there is this innovation out there. We have seen the technologies start going through our licensing process, and just recently last week, we noticed Ontario Power Generation announcing the technology that they have chosen to go with for the first SMR in Canada, which will be located at the Darlington site in Ontario. We also know that this implementation is really going to rely heavily on Indigenous participation. When we're talking about the future of Canada's energy mix, it is really essential that there is Indigenous participation in these decisions. And it will not go ahead, and specifically SMR development will not go ahead without the support of Indigenous communities. So what do we still need to know? Well, we still need to know how we can successfully incorporate this technology into the energy mix. And how do we encourage Indigenous participation in every phase of the process? And I'm talking every phase from now or even prior to now, all through operation and decommission. And really the answer here is from my somewhat biased perspective, engagement. Engagement is really going to be key in this area. And before I really dig into that, I just want to highlight some of the areas that we need to really recognize when we're talking about engagement in this area. And we know that SMR implementation will require a lot of the things we're used to in an engagement strategy. It's going to have to be communication and engagement that's rooted in things like early and often communication. It's going to require a robust educational component to increase the energy literacy in the quote unquote general public. And it'll need to ensure that information is based on community desires and this transparent two-way information flow. But there's a few key things that we actually need to recognize that are unique about this type of engagement. And the first area is engagement fatigue. Now, we know that this is a common issue with any type of engagement, but particularly in the nuclear sector, we have to understand that there is multiple players involved right now. We have industry, government, technology developers, regulators, consultants, providers, manufacturers, researchers like myself. There's a lot of people, and a lot of people are engaging right now across Canada on the same things. And we have to mitigate this fatigue as much as possible. And how do we partner together so that we have the best outcome there? The next one is energy sovereignty. And this is something that is extremely important and arguably has always been important. But with UNDRIP, the modern treaty agreements, recent court cases, these all provide negotiation power for Indigenous communities to assert their sovereignty and have their free and prior informed consent on development projects recognized. This is a really important piece because as we move forward, it's going to be more and more of a requirement. Times are changing from where we were in 1970 to now, and this is something that has to be deeply embedded in the process. And I'll talk about it a little bit more as we move on. And then the trust deficit. So this is really important for understanding that the history of development in Indigenous communities in the past, although we have some amazing examples of how it was done right, we also have some examples of how it was done wrong. And these examples have a lot of conflict and lack of control over the development. And this conflict hasn't been forgotten. It has actually created what we see as a trust deficit. And that trust deficit is really in need of healing. And any public participation process will need to be adapted to recognize or mitigate this deficit by including some of the key elements, which I'll talk about in a moment, to help form these new and positive relationships. And then, as I mentioned earlier, energy literacy. There's a wide variety of energy literacy levels across all communities, all people, all generations, we're finding. And that will be really important to build that up so that people can make the best informed choice for them, which may or may not be, SMR implementation, but at least it's an informed choice. And this leads us to what I would probably highlight as the most important area, or the most critical pieces, is understanding that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Each region has different experiences. They have unique challenges. They have their own unique history. And there's not going to be a framework that we can just pick up and copy paste to everywhere else. The engagement that moves forward will really have to be influenced by the relationships, the impacts and outcomes of engagement of the past as well, and each unique experience. We need to make sure that we're incorporating space for that iterative information flow, of course, culturally appropriateness, and increased local control. So before I get into some ways to do that, I just wanted to clarify some terminology because when I'm talking, I often use these words and expect people to understand what I'm saying without giving them context, recognizing that these sometimes are very interchangeable words: consultation, participation or public participation, and engagement. So when I'm talking about consultation, which is a word that's sometimes used blanket to describe engagement, I'm actually only referring to the regulatory requirements. So this is duty to consult and accommodate, or that legal requirement to consult with Indigenous communities on decisions that impact their Aboriginal rights. With the participation, what I'm talking about there is active participation in all phases and all levels of the project. So this isn't just about engagement, but this is about design, procurement, operations, all the way through, like I said earlier, to decommissioning. And then engagement itself is what I use as more of that blanket term. This is, referring to those formal interactions, but also those informal interactions that can range anywhere from information sharing through to active consultation and then into collaboration in a decision-making process. And, one thing I just want to point out is that effective engagement is open, transparent, it's participatory, and it really allows room for those diverse perspectives. And you'll note that both of the points under engagement, when I talk about engagement, are related to decision making. There has to be an authentic opportunity for those that you're engaging to influence or impact the decision. So often we think about decisions as kind of being the large product of something, whereas in fact, there's multiple decisions that usually lead up to a final decision. Do we put an SMR here or not? We need to really unpack those decisions and understand where the public can actually influence or impact that decision. If there's no opportunity to change somebody's mind, the decision's been made, we shouldn't be engaging. We should really just be informing at that point. So when I say successful engagement, what do I mean? I think we all define success a little bit different. So for me, when I'm talking about successful engagement, I'm talking about what occurs at this intersection between public support, public attitudes, and public knowledge. And this really does start with Indigenous participation and, again, early, meaningful, and authentic engagement. It's so important that Indigenous engagement is so important to SMR implementation because we are seeing, as I alluded to earlier, this need, this requirement for energy sovereignty. And there's more and more litigation that's arising from conflicts over Indigenous consultation on many different types of projects. This does lead to project delays, and it could potentially lead to more economic risks for all that are involved. And we have an environmental assessment process, but it can really only do so much. It's not going to resolve all of these challenges. And that's how come it's so important to be including this participation from the very onset of a project and all the way through. I'm going to sound like a broken record a little bit today when I emphasize the early part, because it is the most overlooked part of the cases that I've been looking at very closely. Sometimes we think we're engaging early enough, and we aren't. So we have to, think about where is the project starting and really get in there. So again, what makes engagement meaningful? So what's that litmus test to understand, like, was this meaningful engagement, or how do I design meaningful engagement? Well, again, it's going to be early. It's going to acknowledge that past history of relationships of consultation. I often tell people that engagement shouldn't be something that's comfortable. If you're not having hard conversations or you aren't feeling uncomfortable at certain times, that's probably a good indicator that you're not quite doing it right. It should be a vulnerable process for both parties involved, because we're asking something of somebody. As engagement practitioners, we also need to be giving something as well. It needs to be community driven. There should be community input. How do you want to be engaged? When do you want to be engaged? At what parts? Who should we be engaging? And the there should be an understanding going into this of the communities, but specifically what their energy makeup and their energy needs are. And that's kind of the first part of my research. The second part is around perspectives. So we need to understand, what are the perspectives that are out there? What's that baseline look like? One more engagement slide before I get into that. So just to kind of sum it all up here, an engagement framework would look something like this. We often think about frameworks as a very linear process, but I like to think about things circular. It's really going to be something that is inclusive. We need to ensure that our engagement processes are designed in a way that respect diversity, promote and allow adequate community contributions, while we're still building those relationships with our diverse group of stakeholders and rights holders. And of course, early involvement. Our rights holders, our stakeholders, they need to be involved early. We need to encourage active participation by helping them, by having them help with the engagement design, helping them defining how they want to be engaged. The engagement process must include that authentic opportunity to influence the decision. It should be rooted in trust, or at least the generation of trust and transparency, by ensuring well-defined terms of engagement or engagement goals and outcomes unique to the specific nature and needs of that community or that stakeholder or rights holder group. The process needs to have mechanisms built in for objective, timely, open, accurate information sharing. This will help enable communities to make self-determined, informed decisions about their energy generation, as well as being willing to collaborate and truly understand what each group brings to the table. Where's the strengths, and how can we look to others to help fill out where we may have a weakness? Specifically, how can a community help our understanding of energy through their knowledge holders, through their users, through their lived experience? That's going to be something that's really important and will build the strength of the project. And of course, relationship building. If I could put a star beside this one, I would. Relationships, again, this is what's going to work towards healing that trust deficit. It's really integral for a successful engagement process. And the one thing I want to just kind of highlight about this part is that relationship building it's not a linear process. So sometimes, if we think about when we're going in to engage on a project, it starts kind of when the project starts and ends when the project ends. That's not how it should be. These are, kind of longer term relationships that if we want to root them in trust, they need to be there. And for those who've heard this story before, I apologize, but I often think of this one story to highlight this. I was in Northern Canada, and I was trying to engage with a community, but I couldn't get a hold of them. And Finally, I'm like, okay, I'm going up there anyways to meet with another group. So I'm just going to pop by. So I popped by their town office. When I was in my last stop in the city, I picked up Tim Hortons, recognizing they were going to have to heat up the coffee, but the donuts were there. And I just dropped them off at the town office. And I said, hey, I'm Dazawray. I've been trying to get a hold of the mayor. Haven't been successful in that. And I just wanted to drop these off to let you know and just introduce myself. And I'm in town for a couple days. And that was it. And I left and went on with my meetings for the day. Later on that evening, just kind of before dinner, I get a phone call to my cell phone from the mayor. And he said, hey, I heard you stop by today. And I said, yeah, I did. I just wanted to bring you guys something because I've been bugging you so much with phone calls and emails and stuff. So I just wanted to, show my appreciation and introduce myself. And he said to me, oh, that was awesome. They really, really liked that. Do you want to come over to my house tonight with my wife and I? We're going to have dinner. And I said, yeah, for sure. So I went over, made amazing dinner. We talked, and it was really about just getting to know me and see if they could trust me. And we talked about our families and what we do and, kind of our backgrounds. And we didn't talk about the research project I was working on at all that night during dinner. And as I was leaving, of course, I'm thanking them for dinner. And he said, you know what, I'm in the office tomorrow. How about you stop by and we can talk about that research project? So it really is a lot about that personal piece to it. So although, you know, sometimes we're in jobs or we're in specific roles, it is really important to build that personal piece. And I will tell you that that was quite a few years ago, and he's now the former mayor, still a very good friend today. Check in with him all the time, and we're still very, very close. So these are things that happen long, relationships that stick around long after the research project or the project itself is done. And then the final piece that we sometimes forget about is this evaluation mechanism, which is really that monitoring or mitigating risks and promoting this idea of continuous improvement of the engagement process. So every time we, you know, go out there, we should be coming back and evaluating and saying, you know, what worked, what didn't work, what went well, what could we improve on, any new risks came up, etc. So that's what your framework should look like. Now, the two pieces I talked about in respect to my research were around perspectives and needs. And so my early research for in 2017, I think seems like a while ago now, looked really at generally broad energy perceptions, but also what were some of the barriers? What were some of those needs within the communities? And so the results that came up were quite consistent across multiple communities that I went to, and a lot of them are represented here. Now there were ones outside of here, but these were the ones most represented. So the first one was the high cost of energy. So it's a severe limitation in some of the more remote communities, and you know, it adds to that individual cost of living and restricting economic opportunities in the region. And this is where people that I talked to really linked it to things like quality of life, because if you're in an area where food security is already an issue, and the grocery store, although energy is subsidized in a lot of places, not for businesses, so the grocery store has to recover their enormous energy bills by marking up the already very expensive food. So there were different ways that this was connected back. The second one is climate change and renewable energy. So there were quite a few concerns about climate change and how this has really changed their view around certain energy systems that are out there. There was a strong current interest, obviously, in renewable resources, but also understanding how renewables can fit in and work in a northern climate or a cold climate or a dark climate, or you know, all of these different unique things that we come across in our north. The third one was this resistance to uranium mining specifically and nuclear energy. So there is some resistance out there, but it's not uniform across the board by any means. But there is, again, a lot of this resistance is based in some of the rationale or reasons that were given were things around that lack of trust or that lack of local control or participation. And that was really where a lot of the resistance pieces came from. And the next one was, again, this knowledge of and education around nuclear energy. So just not really understanding the impact of uranium mining and nuclear energy and some of the public debates and some of the misinformation that is out there, or the technology itself and how it works and what the kind of benefits and downsides of this technology could be. And then some existing concerns, of course, as we see any proponent of a small modular reactor is going to have to overcome some of these existing concerns. And this is really related back to that history of previous developments in the area, poor consultation practices, and then tied back to that resistance piece around lack of local control, local decision-making, etc. And then the last piece, and by far the most surprising piece to me, was this openness to these new energy technologies. I will be honest that I did go into this research with a bias thinking, it's a no-go. We're going to say nuclear and everybody's going to, nope, not happening. That was a while ago, and I've definitely since changed my thoughts on that. But there is this openness to these new energy technologies. So we're going to fast forward now to 2019, 2020, the good times right before COVID. And one of the things that we did was working on my PhD research, but also in connection with another project. We did a telephone survey sample of perspectives in Saskatchewan and Ontario. And this sample that we did, we had 10,014 respondents in Saskatchewan and 1,008 in Ontario. And of those respondents, I was really looking at the Indigenous component, and we had 101 and 50. And so in Saskatchewan, the Indigenous respondents make up about 10% of the total sample and 5% in Ontario, which is in line with our census. Our Aboriginal people make up about 5% of the national population, and 12% or 11.7% in Saskatchewan, and only 1.8% in Ontario. So relatively representative there. I don't have time. I wish I had time to go through all the results. I find them extremely interesting, and I'd love to share them all, but I just wanted to highlight a few key ones while I have just a couple more minutes here. So we asked them about level of support, and this was, broadly across there. And the really important takeaway from this is that there is a big difference between level of support for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. And we'll see solar, wind, a lot of those renewables generate high levels of support. Small modular reactors specifically, the support for non-Indigenous participants in Saskatchewan was actually higher than for Indigenous participants. So we'll keep that in mind for the next couple slides here. The next thing we asked was what source of energy would do the best job at providing safe, reliable, suitable electricity at the lowest possible cost. And this is where we see kind of this beautiful graph of again, solar being by far the top, hydro coming in as well. And SMRs, and sorry, I realize it's tiny here, but SMRs are right the fourth from last there. And then of course, biomass has very, very low support. Then the next thing we asked was for them to look ahead. So we said, okay, now looking into the future, 10 years, what do you think is going to be the primary source of electricity? And again, solar is really topping out that list in both provinces. But in both Ontario and Saskatchewan, coal with carbon capture storage right here is quite low, and biomass were amongst the lowest. So just some of our overall conclusions. As I said, I can't go through all the results with you, but there was 88 questions in total, so there's a lot of data in there. But it really does show that Saskatchewan, Ontario residents, there's an overall support for solar. It was really favored in each and every one of the questions we asked, regardless of which province they lived in, or whether they were Indigenous or non-Indigenous, whether they were female or male or other. The overall support for SMRs is relatively split, though. There is still less support for SMR development by Indigenous people than for non-Indigenous people. And this trend really remained constant throughout all of the questions. What's interesting, though, is that SMRs were ranked as the third top choice for providing that safe, reliable, and suitable energy across all of the groups. So really, we need to understand the deeper context behind these surveys. I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I love surveys because I love statistics, but I also love that qualitative piece of where I can get in and talk to people and say, like, why did you answer this way? What is it about? So that leads to where I am right now in my research. So I just finished focus groups with a lot of these participants across northern Saskatchewan and northern Ontario, to really dig into some of those nuances and get in there. So there's a couple places or a couple things to think about when we're talking about where do we go from now, or what are our next steps. And again, we have this opportunity, and I see the opportunity as there is support out there. We've seen that there is support out there. SMRs are a potential option for providing this safe, reliable, and suitable energy. But the biggest piece I see, and again, my bias from that engagement background is going to come in here, but it's an opportunity to change the way that we engage in energy projects. It's not about engaging because we have to do it or it's the right thing to do, but it's engaging because we want to, and we want to be in that collaborative space. We have the potential here to kind of set those gold star examples of how to engage on energy projects with SMR implementation. A couple key takeaways that if you only remember 3 things today from everything I talked about, it is that SMR implementation is really dependent on community support. Meaningfully engaging and involving the communities will be important for the development of this support and for SMR implementation. Community support is ultimately increased when your framework for engagement is both extensive and inclusive. A poorly executed engagement framework could jeopardize the overall implementation and adoption of SMRs. And not only if we're looking at Saskatchewan or Alberta or Ontario, New Brunswick specifically, but across Canada, which would then, of course, hinder a potential benefit of reducing our GHG emissions as a nation. And finally, and probably the most important takeaway I want you to leave with is that Indigenous nations are self-determining nations. Local control will be central to the implementation and success of these new developments. Energy sovereignty is a conversation that will have to be part of that engagement process. So my next steps, as I said, I just finished working on some of these focus groups, but that's really going to get down to some of those the context and nuances behind the answers and set us up. But if you remember back to that slide, those were only 2 pieces of a much bigger puzzle. So the one piece is that engagement fatigue. How do we address that? Well, we're going to have to start looking at collaborative engagement. And by collaborative engagement, I mean within the SMR, within the nuclear energy sector. How do we work together to ease that engagement fatigue? The next thing we're going to have to do is, again, if you think back to those bubbles, is community driven. So understanding how the communities would like to be engaged. What are their trusted or preferred information sources? How do they want to be included in the design of the process? And again, finally, we need to work with the communities to ensure that Indigenous energy sovereignty is respected and adhered to, and it's part of the conversation. So that is my talk today. I just want to make sure that I'm giving a lot of thanks because there's been a lot of people who've supported my research over the years. Of course, Yukon University has supported me greatly this year with a scholarly activity grant to help do some of the writing for and data analysis for these focus groups. Johnson Shoyama, of course, is the school with my PhD and supported these crazy ideas I had as I go along. And as part of Johnson Shoyama is the Center for Science and Innovation Policy. And a lot of the work that we did, including the survey, was through CSIP. And then the Sylvia Fedoric Center for Nuclear Innovation, which funded the early research in 2017, and Can Do Owners Group, which funded the survey research. So lots of people out there who have been helping me and supporting me. So thank you all very much. I was trying to get a lot of information out in a very short time. Anyone who knows me knows I like to talk a lot. So hopefully I didn't go too fast.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Dazawray. I certainly have questions, but I'll wait and see if anyone else does. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Please feel free to go ahead and unmute if you have questions you'd like to ask, and I'll be watching the chat as well. Go ahead, Tassi.
Hello there. Thanks for the presentation. It was very informative. And my question would be in regards to, I guess, nuclear waste management, and in regards to that and engagement. Like, I would find that it would be kind of a tough spiel to kind of engage with, I guess, First Nations, and I guess having to touch upon the topics. Whereas, when it comes to, I guess, nuclear waste management, I think that it's a process that takes generations, I guess. And I was just wondering, and also too is just like what effects in regards to waste management have been, I guess what when it comes to waste management and First Nations communities, what has been the kind of the scenario. I'll stop there.
Yeah. That's it. Well, that's a very big question, but I think it's a really good point, because waste management is definitely something that comes up in every conversation when we're talking nuclear. It's a common thing. When we're talking about engagement, the engagement around nuclear waste is its own engagement process that's separate from the implementation. Now, I know in the world of it, it's separate, but when we're out in the communities, it's not as separate of a conversation because they are very integrated. It's also regulated, and we have the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that regulates how and where and through what process waste is distributed. But I think the important thing that we can really take away from this is that regardless of how it's separated on a regulatory perspective, that conversation is, it is linked, and communities are going to talk about that, and they are going to want to know about that. And I think that that's where the energy literacy piece really comes in, making sure that there's an understanding of what the waste is. So we're talking waste from a small modular reactor being very different than the waste from uranium mining or the waste from a full-scale nuclear reactor. So understanding the differences between that, but then also understanding the long-term effects of what that waste is, where it's going to be stored, et cetera, transported, broken down. Those are all very important things that will come up and have to be communicated. And in the engagement that I have done with SMRs thus far, it's often been extremely helpful to have a partner from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization available to answer a lot of these questions.
Thank you for the great question. Does anyone else have a question or a point of discussion to bring up? While we're waiting, I'm curious, Dazawray, whether there are some key champions or leaders that are really doing this work well across the country right now that people are sort of looking to.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of opportunity. So when I say there's an opportunity to change the way we engage, we are really seeing that happen right now. So we have so many people in this field, and specifically, if we look at OPG, which is really leading leading the implementation with choosing their technology and site, with the recent announcements, and they are really working hard to form those relationships with their Indigenous communities around there. I don't want to speak for the communities themselves to try to evaluate, but from my perspective, the outside looking in at their process, they've done an amazing job there. Saskatchewan, again, they've really just started to get into their engagement process, looking at having the conversations around SMRs. But we also have Indigenous partners that are also on this place where they're like, okay, let's get involved. Let's start talking about this. And, we have First Nations Power Authority, who's been working deeply in this, Creative Fire, and Dazawray Corporation, who's also been working at this. And these are 100% owned Indigenous companies that are really in this sector. And then individual communities themselves have been really taking charge and asserting a lot of that energy sovereignty, and that is absolutely wonderful to see.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the last of our four-part Indigenous Governance Speaker Series, and we hope to see you all return with us on January 18th for the next 4-part series with Pleacho Elder John Bezo. And thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much, Dazawray, for the great talk.
You're welcome. Thank you, Rhiannon, and thanks everyone for coming.